Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Secrets of Master Astrologers Summit. I'm your host, Suzanne Gerber, and I'm so happy that you're joining us for this incredible 3-week series where I get to interview some of the most incredible astrologers out there. Today's guest is a new friend. She's an astute astrologer and clearly an old soul. I met her on one of my many excursions into just learning about practitioners of different styles and approaches to astrology. And I guess you could say it's an occupational hazard. And I was so happy to stumble on Katie Emma and her beautiful, soulful Temple of Cosmic Astrology school and her whole soul-based approach to our favorite subject. Though young in terms of solar returns, Katie has spent most of her life studying, researching, practicing astrology, and sharing it. In fact, she first got hooked on it at the ripe old age of 9 when she found a copy of Linda Goodman's now classic Sun Signs book. Katie has spent the last 12 years teaching astrology courses and leading spiritual development workshops and retreats in her home country of Australia, in Bali, the UK, and Portugal, her current home base. She founded the Temple of Cosmic Astrology School in 2017 during her Saturn return. So now you can figure out her age, with the aim of teaching students how to use the symbolism of astrology as a tool for self-development and evolution, and to give them, as she puts it, the skills to divine the language of the cosmos. I love that. Today, Katie is going to talk about something we both believe is a very important subject. And she puts a soul-empowered twist on it. It's a talk she's calling, "It's Hip to Have Squares, the Gift of the 90-Degree Angle." And now it is my tremendous pleasure to introduce you to Katie Emma. Welcome to the summit, Katie.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you for that beautiful intro. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be sharing about one of my favorite angles, the square, one of the more tricky ones, but one that I hope to, shed a bit of a new light on for everybody today.
Well, okay, so that's a perfect place to start. Yeah. Not to put you on the spot.
Yeah.
But can we do the full disclosure thing, Katie? Why are you the perfect person to lead this conversation?
So I have a lot of squares in my chart, like a lot, both fixed and mutable. And I will be bringing up my chart sort of as we move into this, but I have a Sun, Moon, Pluto T-square, all at exact degrees. And I also have Chiron exactly square my nodes as a bridging degree. And so I feel like I kind of travel with squares. Like there's no on or off with squares for me. It's just complete immersion and enmeshment with these angles. So my hope and my aim today is to be able to, like I said, shed a bit of light on these squares for you at home, and to show you how we can actually work with this dynamic energy instead of feeling like these angles are working against us, which it is easy to feel that as we are learning about astrology and learning about ourselves.
No, I think that's fantastic. And, there's a couple of big trends I see happening in astrology in general. And one is kind of going back to very, very traditional, medieval, all the rules and the principles and the aphorisms and the Hellenistic approach. And that's wonderful. And I feel like there's an equal and kind of divergent approach, which is much more, and not just psychological, but soul oriented. And this is what I love about your work, that you don't look at this as, you're doomed, it's an affliction, you will only spend your life struggling. It's much more, it's humanistic. It takes a view of, hey, your chart is not an accident. There's a reason this is here. If you start with that premise, what can you learn and how can you use this to grow?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that when we come into astrology and, we get beyond the basics of just our sun sign and, maybe we get to the point that we can, look at a chart and we start to see the angle the lines in the middle of the chart, and we start to question, what is this? When we see all of those red lines, we kind of go, oh my God, and then we do a quick Google search, or, a kind of cookbook style astrology book. And a lot of the time it will start to be, inadvertently along those kind of you're doomed kind of lines. And, being a 12th house sun as well, I'm also well versed in coming across information that likes to say that I'm also doomed in that sort of path. And it's like, okay, there has to be another way with this, because, I didn't choose this in terms of like being Katie Emma as a human being in my meat suit and all of that. If I could, I think if I could choose another chart, of course we would like to maybe choose the path of grace and ease. But I know that on a soul level, and when I also look at like, my parents' charts and my grandparents and all of that, it's like, okay, I definitely chose this chart. And there's magic to be found in working with this. And there's magic within squares. It's definitely not all heaviness. And if it is, there's ways to transform that. And I want to show you today how we can use squares as these transformers and this evolutionary tool.
Well, let's just jump right into that.
Yeah, right. Just take us straight into there. So I think what I'll actually do is I'm going to bring up my chart just to show everybody, because there is just a lot kind of going on in here. So just bear with me a second.
It's also a way for people that just have one or two squares to say, well, she seems to be pretty happy and doing well in her life. Maybe
for the most part,
maybe I'm not doomed, right?
Exactly. So I'm just going to clean this up a little bit, just so that we can take everything out of it, just for the time being, that isn't in a square per se. So just a second, just to make it really clear, especially for those of you that are maybe just a little bit more beginners. Let me check. We don't need Saturn either. Okay, perfect. So we can see here that when we're looking at a chart, when we have these lines here, with the little square symbol, this is indicating a square for you. And if we have the square symbols here plus the opposition sign as well, this is showing something in astrology that we call a T-square. And I actually love T-squares, and that probably sounds kind of strange, but I've had to learn to love my T-square, and I want to.
Very Plutonian.
Yeah, right. And that was kind of my next step with that, is like, if we have a look here at, my sun moon opposition, that, I was born right on a full moon. Both my sun and moon are squaring my Pluto. And so when we have a T-square, we look to the planet that's kind of forming, I guess we could say, the apex of this triangle shape that has been formed, this T-square. And so for me, it's Pluto. Great. Just to add some intensity into that. But so Pluto, for me personally, in my T-square, acts as this transformer, which Pluto is in of itself a transformer, an evolutionary marker point. And so if you as well in your own chart have a T-square, for example, you want to be having a look at the planet here that is forming that top point, because that is your way sort of out and through what the opposition is bringing up for you. And I think that we can't really talk about squares without mentioning the opposition either, because I think that there's sometimes is a little bit of, I don't know if it's confusion, but, how can I put it? I think that oppositions are actually easier to navigate than squares. And maybe some people may not agree with me with that, but I think that with the opposition, the purpose of it is to find that balance. And so it can be a bit of an uncomfortable path to walk as we navigate that seesaw and finding that balance and that midpoint. But with a square, there is technically a midpoint if we get into like a big midpoint discussion, but I'll keep it nice and simple for today. But with that square, it is just a pure sort of energy or alignment of friction, of discomfort, but it is also very dynamic. And I think that it's what creates action in our lives. I don't know about you, Suzanne, and if you have any squares in your own chart, but I feel like for me, it's my squares that kind of give me that drive and that tenacity and that force in life, like that life force even, I guess you could say.
Oh, I agree completely. I have a grand cross
Okay.
involving my nodes, which are always going to be in opposition, and
Yep.
they form a cross with my Chiron Uranus, because so many of us of different generations have
Mhm.
Chiron and Uranus in opposition. Now,
Yes.
Katie, before you go much further, it's just occurred to me that a lot of people are right there with you. And there's also people that are going to be like, wait, I'm still like learning the aspects. Give me a
Yep.
shortcut to find oppositions and squares. So this might be a great moment just to make it easy for newer students.
Yeah, absolutely. So the opposition is formed when we have two planets on the opposing but same axis, right? So we can see here in this example, my sun is in Aquarius in my 12th house. So my moon is also at 13 degrees. So it's naturally forming an opposition in Leo in my 6th house. And so if you're looking at a chart, you want to look literally for the same axis, the same house axis, and that will be forming that opposition. Now, for the square, we are looking for 90-degree angles that are being formed in the chart. And so that is what is creating this sort of square alignment. And this is why I often think of friction when I think of squares, because the squares are kind of meeting, and I'm just going to use my hands for this, but right, like the squares kind of meeting in this point here. And so when we have sort of anything kind of coming into this point and this force, there is it's going to feel uncomfortable, right? They're kind of bumping up against each other. There's no space in between the square like there is with that opposition. And that is what I think kind of also creates this, what I call this sacral force with a square. And over my own studies and things outside of astrology too, different kind of healing modalities and things like that, in my own understanding of the sacral, whether it's the chakra or just speaking just within the body itself, I feel like so much of our drive and our life force sits within this space. And when I look at my own chart and what is created in this dynamic energy between these squares, I really liken it to my sacral. And, it's what really keeps me going, even in those moments that I just want to kind of flip a few tables and throw it all in and say, oh God, this is just too much. But it's those moments, often, of course, in hindsight, it's normally not in the moment, right? I'm not here to kind of glorify challenge or anything like that. When we're in the trenches, especially when we have transits to our natal squares, we're too in those trenches to be thinking like, what a blessing this square is in my life, right? We're kind of just, we're trying to survive. And, we're not even thinking about thriving in those moments, right? But often once that transit will separate and move off that square, or any other transit really you could apply this to, we kind of can catch our breath a little bit. We can kind of go, oh, okay, I have a little bit more space, a little bit more room to move now. And it's often in those moments that we are able to sort of start to see, I guess what a blessing these moments can be. But I did just sort of want to give some encouragement, especially if anyone watching now, we have so much fixed square energy happening at the time of recording this, right, in 2022. We have Saturn and Uranus still in a separating square, though in 2021 it was much more intense. So if any of you are listening and you have fixed placements, you've been going through it, right? Just like I have. It's been a lot to navigate. And so my intention with this talk is just to kind of remind you that there's a bigger purpose and a reason for this, even if it doesn't make sense in the moment. So hopefully that makes sense. I feel like that was a bit of a convoluted kind of route to explaining those squares and oppositions, but it's classic me.
No, it's perfect. It's not convoluted. It's what's necessary. And I would just say one thing I would add to it, Katie, is when I teach, I'm sure you're the same way. I really encourage people to trust their intuition, but I say that the more you learn the rules, the more your intuition will flow. And this is a case where you've got to learn the rules. You have to understand the signs and their polarities, because that's how you automatically find the oppositions.
Yep.
And then the squares will be when planets are always occur with planets in the same mode or quadruplicity, meaning, of
Yes,
course, cardinal, fixed, mutable. And
exactly.
astrologists need to learn them. And then you start to get into degrees and closeness and something like yours, which is, I also think of a square as like bone on bone.
Yeah. Yeah,
It,
that's a
it
great way of
hurts, it
describing it.
grinds.
Yeah, because often that's such a great way, because I think I'm going to borrow that ongoing, if that's okay, because
Please
I
do.
I normally describe it to my students as like you know, like the gears inside like an old kind of clock, you know, that, and the gears are like grinding up against each other, you know. That's also, I think, how a square tends to
Yeah.
feel, especially when it's being triggered by a transit. It's really kind of pushing and squeezing you, but I believe that it's to squeeze the best out of us. And that is something that I think comes with maturity. And, you know, not to sound in that sort of way of like, oh, you know, as you grow older, you just learn things, but it's true. You know, me when I was 20, you know, I have a lot of Sagittarius in my chart. I would have been like, yeah, okay, whatever, old lady, you know. But now that I'm in my mid 30s, I'm really starting to appreciate what I think that is a slow burn that squares offer us. It takes a lot of practice. It's a lot of, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, but it's a dance that I feel like I'm starting to, like, I think I've figured out the moves now. I'm kind of okay on my own to kind of to do that dance and to trust that, okay, sometimes there's a bit of a fumble or a moment that feels slightly out of rhythm, but you begin to sort of, you know, through your life experience, pick up those tools or those skills to get back into that flow again. And I feel like that is really what squares can offer us.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of how we approach and work with both our natal squares and then, well, them getting activated by transits and then transiting planets that form squares, which this falls into the same count, I think is it's not the planets, it's us, right? It
Yep.
has to do with, do we think that we're victims or do we think that we're on a hero's journey, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. You know, and something I think I've also come to understand, you know, through my many years of astrology, study of astrology, and also through many years of, you know, working with a therapist at different points in my life, or even other healing modalities, is that I've realized that my squares and also my oppositions in my own personal case, because I have a T square, um, but these are the points that become such a foundation for my personal therapy work, you know. And I also encourage those of you watching this that, you know, if you are in a space in your life where you feel like you need, you know, therapeutic support, and you have that capacity to be able to invest in that for yourself, you know, but you're not really sure, like, what am I going to talk about when I'm on that therapist couch, or even with an astrologer or another healing modality, look to your squares. You know, that is going to show you an area of your life that, you know, there's a lot to unpack. And it's a good sort of starting point. I think even sort of, that's what I love about the psychological astrology framework, is that it offers us so much in terms of self-reflection and also our evolution. You know, I feel like Vedic astrology is an amazing branch of astrology. If you're more kind of into, you know, predictive techniques and things like that, it's, you know, I have no skills as a Vedic astrologer, although I find it very fascinating. It's just not my personal forte. But Western astrology or psychological astrology is using astrology as a tool to understand yourself, to be able to maybe even start to get into more of that sort of soul astrology, like Suzanne mentioned, and start to sort of piece together like the why behind these certain aspects. Because, you know, it's not the aspects that that make things happen. It's not like, oh, well, okay, you know, the sun is square Jupiter today and this is why this happened in my life. It's like it creates the environment. And so if you can look at your natal chart as a snapshot of this kind of psychological landscape or environment, It's such a great way to, even bridge more kind of traditional sort of therapies with something sort of more esoteric like astrology. I really believe that the two can work beautifully hand in hand together.
Is it appropriate to ask you how you've done that? Like how one has informed the other in your personal life? You don't have to
Yeah, no,
overly revealing, but give people examples of how this awareness of this pattern dynamic in the chart can translate into the therapeutic work. And then of course, ultimately, so how does that translate into a transformed life?
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. So I'll bump back to my chart for a second again, just so everyone can see.
For those who haven't memorized it, yeah.
So, I have not only my sun square Pluto, but also my moon. And so having the sun and moon square Pluto shows that there is a lot of stuff psychologically with both parents, right? Or even, the more authority, it can even be authority figures in life, both masculine and feminine. I have both. So there's a lot of stuff for me, and also I have Chiron. We'll just bring that in too. It's in a different square, but my Chiron is also in my 4th house. And so for me, it's definitely been a lot of understanding, who I am in the context of my early life experiences. Also my father was adopted. I'm not, but I feel like there's kind of with my Chiron in the 4th house, it's like there's such a curiosity of like, well, where did I come from? There's a bit of a barrier or a block there. And it's not my journey to sort of be, searching for my parents or anything. I know my parents, but through my father, there's that kind of wall, I guess you could say. And it's actually fascinating because on my mum's side, both of her parents, there's adoption just one level above that too. And so there's this kind of feeling for me, especially as an only child, of, I don't know if it's necessarily aloneness, but it's like everywhere I turn, it's like there is a sort of a missing link in the chain of my ancestry. And so for me, it's been through this transformative Plutonian energy of really like wanting to get to the core, or, even like Suzanne said, like the bone upon bone, like that rubbing feeling of like, it feels so uncomfortable, this kind of family, dynamic for me. I want to figure all of this out. And so therapy for me has been brilliant over the years because it helped me like form my own foundation, form my own family within myself. And it has also been a brilliant space for me to then incorporate into my own astrology practice because, I think all of us listening to this know that there's always a little bit of magic present. And it's fascinating how many clients come to me who have a similar kind of chironic experience with the family. Maybe they also have moon Pluto aspects, and I don't really advertise that on my website anywhere that I'm a specialist with these kind of things, but it's incredible how often my own chart kind of reflects back to me through my students, through my clients, and that, my work with them also becomes deep work for myself. And that has been really, I think, how I've sort of begun this process of transforming, because I think it's important to also mention that it's a lifelong process. There is no point that you ever get to in any capacity, in astrology, outside of astrology, just life in general, where you have it all together, right? There's certain phases of integration and acceptance and understanding of like, okay, I can see that pattern now, I understand it. But it is still a part of you that you are constantly growing and evolving through. And I think that to look at squares as something to be fixed or all put together or all figured out, is doing a disservice to why this energy is present in your life. It's meant to help you continually blossom, and I don't really like this word, but flourish. I don't know, I just have this aversion to that word, but it does help you over time to flourish. But it is definitely a very sort of deep process for sure.
So it sounds like what we're both saying is how we work with them starts with a belief system. And if we're allowing them to feel painful, difficult, challenging, oppressive, you don't change the square, you change your view, and you at least be open. Even not everybody can get there, like you said. When you're in the throes of something, nobody is going to go, thank you.
Yeah.
Again,
Exactly.
we're not masochists. And yet there really is a way, right?
Yep.
To start to more than embrace it, but really start to embody it. How can people do
Absolutely.
that? So there are people out there that are going, yeah, easy for her. Okay, maybe not easy for her, but
Yeah.
how? What are some of the things that have been helpful for you, that are helpful for people in your life, students, to actually start to, because this is what we're talking about. It
Yeah.
isn't about learning new astrology. It's about shifting to learn the lessons, right? To gain
Yep.
from
Yep.
from this beautiful code.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, again, I can sort of only speak more from personal experience in this sense, but for me, it's had to come through a a path of self-trust, especially with Pluto being that apex, right? I had to just learn to trust myself. And I know that sounds so kind of, okay, Katie, like that's so easy, but it's been, like I said earlier, that sort of example I gave of like that dance, it's like, it's taken me a lot of time and a lot of missteps, a lot of, even missed opportunities, and a lot of maybe detours and things like that to build that strength and that trust in myself. But that's what I also meant earlier about this kind of maturity that naturally comes in. I think as well, definitely sort of post Saturn return. And again, before my Saturn return, when I was learning astrology at that point, I would have been like, oh, yeah, whatever, Saturn in Sagittarius here, right? Like I had to be humbled. But post Saturn return, and I think sort of pre midlife transits, in our 30s here, it's such a fertile ground to really face ourselves. And astrology can be such a brilliant tool. As I said, I think in bridging, or finding that support to be able to face ourselves and sit in that discomfort. Because yes, squares are going to bring you in some shape or form some discomfort to your life, but there is a rhyme and there is a reason to that. And in one capacity, astrologers can kind of help you pinpoint that. As I said, so can therapists. If you were able to go into that therapy session and be like, I have, you don't have to even use astrology terminology, right? Because maybe a lot of therapists would be, maybe not as supportive of you as they probably should be if you start using that lingo. So that's been something big for me too, actually, is like learning the language of astrology, but then teaching myself a dialect of how I could share that with people who aren't really as into astrology. And that's been something really important for me, is like, how can I just use the English language to talk about this stuff without being like moon square Pluto and people looking at me like I have two heads? So,
So,
with like,
so
yeah,
what would you say to people that are still trying to make sense? And again, we don't do cookie cutter astrology here, but there are
yep,
certain tendencies, right? There's certain likelihoods that come with a moon square Pluto and with a sun square Pluto.
yeah,
And they're some of the most intense of all the squares that
yes.
people are going to learn about. How do you translate that into English?
Well, I think that in the most kind of basic framework, Sun square Pluto is going to show power struggles with masculine figures in one's life. Again, it doesn't necessarily have to be men, but often it is through the father or the father's lineage. And then the same would be for the moon square Pluto, but it is often with the mother. And so if you, for example, if you have these particular aspects in your own chart, maybe you also have moon square Pluto, for example, maybe this is bringing up something within you of being like, my relationship with my mother has always been quite challenging, but not in a way that I've always been able to kind of make sense of. And so for me, being able to have like therapy work, or even again, my own self-study of astrology, it really helped me to be able to sort of pinpoint, why, like how this environment was created, even going back into like my birth story and even knowing about my mother's pregnancy and all of these things. I'm like, oh my God, it just screams moon square Pluto. Like it's the Hades moon. Like it is a living, breathing example of that. But knowing that, like, from that challenge, like, I feel like it just gives me such a depth of this humanistic connection, like you sort of said earlier. Like, I love that, like, because I do like to see myself as like a more of a humanistic type of astrologer. And these placements really helped me to trust myself, but to also humanize my experience. Like, it's okay to have these signatures, that there's nothing wrong with you, because often when we have like a Pluto square, we tend to internalize a lot of the external circumstances that have created this dynamic. You know, it's why we are showing this. You know, often, you know, like with Moon square Pluto, it says much more about the, you know, a parent or the environment that you grew up in, rather than you yourself. Now, you have that signature in your chart, and so you are the transformer. You are the one that is, you know, shifting that dynamic, which can be a lot. Like, you know, it's karmically, like, it's a lot. You know, I do want to say that too. I'm not trying to romanticize this at all. But yeah, hopefully that makes sense in terms of how I've sort of been able to bridge that.
No, it makes a lot of sense. And of course, every square is going to be unique. And then of course, there's the houses that they're, the signs,
Exactly.
the modes that they're in, because they will be in the same mode. Some astrologers work with, you know, squares coming from other signs, like at the
Yeah.
end and the beginning. I find that waters down the intensity of the square, don't you?
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And it's so funny because in my first year group at the moment, I was teaching them aspects last term. And so we were talking about the square a lot, and a lot of my students have T squares actually in this particular group. But a lot of them have out of sign squares, like just by a degree or so, you know, because maybe they have a planet at like 29 degrees or 0 degrees. And the way that I actually taught that was like, you know, you guys are just first year. We probably shouldn't even be speaking about out of sign aspects. But since you all have them, just know that it is, you know, the same sort of archetype applies. But like you said, Suzanne, it is this kind of more, it's slightly more watered down. It sort of just lessens that intensity. It's bringing in, you know, instead of it being the same modality, right? Like, for example, two fixed planets, you know, could maybe be like fixed and cardinal or something like that. So yeah, it's, if you have that, I would say that's probably a little bit more advanced astrology to be unpacking.
Yeah, I just wanted to just to
It's a
bring it
good
up.
point.
And then the houses, of course, like yours
Yep.
are all cadent. So I
Yes.
just wonder if that, but they're fixed. So they're very intractable, but they might be harder to access in the cadent houses. How do you play with those differences?
Yeah, that's good spotting and a great question. So that's definitely something that comes into this too. You know, I think that out of all of the squares, I think that having fixed squares is, again, other astrologers may see this differently, but I think they tend to be the most challenging, just because the very nature of fixed is rigidity, and a square, in a sense, is kind of creating that friction or rigidity. So it's kind of doubling down on what a square can actually be. Now, if you have mutable squares, for example, the nature of, you know, mutable is, you know, a little bit more movement, freedom, spaciousness, more of a curiosity to kind of dip your toe into maybe the archetype of the next sign, for example. You know, it's that shifting of the seasons. And so when we have, you know, mutable squares, there's just naturally a little bit more breathing space. You know, it's kind of like wearing, you know, a shirt that's a size too big. You know, it's just kind of like, it's still, you know, it can be uncomfortable in some circumstances, but super comfortable in others. And I find that with cardinal squares, they can also be challenging in the sense of, you know, cardinal is all about initiating, right? Like the cardinal signs are all about new beginnings, initiating, pioneering, getting into the thick of things, but they don't always have the staying power that fixed signs do. And so what can be challenging if you have cardinal squares is that maybe you're really like all about wanting to learn about yourself and gung-ho about like, I'm going to figure out who I am and what I'm about, but you don't always have the staying power with that cardinal square to hang around and really get to the root of that. And I think that the fixed squares then sometimes stay a little bit too long, right? You can actually then have that tendency of like, often depression can absolutely be something that can come up with a fixed square. Any square, I do want to say though, but particularly the fixed, because it can be really hard to see a way out of it when you are getting stuck in that sort of fixed energy of like, this is, who I am, and this is how I define myself, and, this is the cards I was dealt, and I just have to put up with it and get on with it. And it's like, oftentimes life will humble you and maybe, you may have to go through a period of, burnout and not really being able to leave the house much or get out of bed, because life is saying to you, like, you have to sit with this, but not to cling to it, right? But to transform through it. And so when you mix that in then with the houses, of course, like, so, as Suzanne said, like for me, it's fixed and cadent. It can definitely bring sort of like a bit of an internal sort of tug of war, I think, because the fixed energy really wants to sort of stay in that energy, especially with Pluto, right? Like, I mean, I'm part of the Pluto in Scorpio generation. So, we are like the ultimate kind of emos, I think. Like, emo culture like was birthed when we were teenagers, right? Like, of course it came through when Pluto and Scorpio generation were defining themselves. Like, we define ourselves by our pain. That is how we learn, and that is how we are actually also transforming the collective, because our generation is here to, speak up and say, I feel terrible today, and that's okay. Like, I'm sad, I'm depressed, I'm unhappy, and that we don't have to push that down. Like, we are a generation that is speaking up about that. However, it can definitely pose a challenge when we sort of get sort of stuck in that web.
Excuse me. I do agree with what you're saying. And I do feel like when there's any kind of preponderance, whether it's just a lot of planets in fixed signs or fixed houses, or squares in fixed signs, I think that often there is, just like you were saying, there's a tendency to think, there's no other way to think about this. There's no other way to do it. This is it, because fixed can, the upside, right? What we love about fixity is they don't quit. They get the job done. They are going to stay with it until it finishes. But the flip side of that, the denser aspect of it, is they don't let go. It's like, okay, it's time for me. It's really time to drop that.
Really, yep.
And what I have found with a lot of cardinal squares, and especially when you get into the Grand Cross, the fourth planet there, these people have so much ambition. They're so talented. There's so many gifts. They don't know where to go. It locks in. It becomes almost like a vicious cycle where they can't find an application to actually do it. And then, like you said, carry on and do it. It's just so many ideas that nothing happens.
Absolutely. And I think what you said there about how it locks in, I think that's a great way to describe it, especially if you happen to have a cross in your chart. So that would be, two oppositions, which is then forming like a cross in the chart. And so, what can happen with that is that there really feels like there's no way out. Like, at least with the T-square and being 3, with that singular planet being that apex, that way out, if you can kind of understand the archetype of that particular planet and, what that means, adding on the layer of like the house, of course, any aspects that are also being made secondary to that planet, you can be like, when you're in the throes of the challenge and the hardship of what that square may be bringing up on a mundane sort of everyday level, you can remind yourself like, oh, okay, Jupiter is on my apex. Like, I need to just maybe, lighten up a little bit, when that opposition is really kind of making me feel pulled in 2 different directions. Like, Jupiter is that way forward, or Pluto, or, Saturn, maybe with Saturn, it's like you actually need to learn to rein it in a little bit more. Which can be challenging for some personalities, of course. But when it is that cross, it's really hard, because it's like, no matter which way you turn, it feels like there is maybe, in a sense, like a door closed, or there's just a bit of a wall to climb over to get there. And, with all of the modalities, you have that ability to overcome that. But I think learning the modality, I think even in a sense, the modalities are something that tend to get missed a lot. You know, it's something that we learn kind of very early on, and then we sometimes tend to forget about it, you know, because there's just so many other things to be looking at it in the chart. But you know, from teaching beginners groups, you know, every year, and taking people through, like, you know, for almost, we do about 9 months a year, it's, you know, we spend a lot of time in these basics, the elements, the modalities, and those are the keys to piecing it all together. You know, it's all well and good if you know, like, oh, you know, my Venus is in, you know, Virgo in my 8th house. But if you don't understand, you know, mutability and, you know, that earth element, you know, you're missing a big part of the picture of that particular placement. So, you know, yeah, the modalities are a great way, especially with squares and oppositions, because it's keeping it within that same modality. It will help you understand, yeah, a little bit more of how that dynamic is coming into play for you.
You know, I just had a thought that if you have squares and T-squares and even, you know, the Grand Cross, it can be like a masterclass in understanding that modality and through your own chart. Because, oh boy, are you going to learn what that's like to really be fixed, to really be cardinal, to really be mutable, because it's in a challenging position. And, you know, going back to what we were saying, you could be the victim, you could be the hero. Well, if this is your sacred mission, maybe part of your sacred mission is to learn what both the gifts and the trappings are, and then to choose how you want to use them judiciously in your own life.
Absolutely. You know, I think that's such a great way of putting it. And, you know, that's kind of why, in terms of even the topic and the name that I kind of put together with this, like, it's funny because I mean, I can admit it, it's so cheesy. Like, it's hip to have squares. But like, when I was trying to think of a name for this, you know, I was kind of just pondering a few things, and, you know, we all know the song, like, it's hip to be square, just kind of like filtered into my mind. You know, I have Mercury retrograde in my 12th house, and sometimes things just appear to me like that. And I kind of laughed to myself, and I was like, oh, that's so cringe, like, Katie, no. And then I couldn't shake it. And I was like, you know what? I think it is kind of catchy, and it does sort of encapsulate what I'm trying to convey here, which is like, your squares offer you so much. And yes, it's a painful, transformative, uncomfortable experience. But through maturity, I think that that's where we can kind of be like, it is hip per se to have these placements, because that's what kind of creates nuance in individuals. I think, you know, it's our squares, it's our differences, it's our challenges that ultimately bring us together as, you know, people coming from the external or within yourself, like bringing yourself back together after a challenging period. And, you know, that challenging period could be, you know, I mean, we're in what, 24 hours away at the moment from the eclipse in Taurus. And so again, if any of you have fixed planets, you know, these eclipse cycles, your number's up, right? You know, you've taken the ticket and you're about to be called with these eclipses. And so, you know, it's very much a process that we're in at the moment for fixed signs of, you know, your soul or the universe, you know, however you see it, it's like decisions and moves are being made for you. You know, it's actually a process where you need to sort of step back, I think, from being as forceful or tenacious as this energy makes you naturally, because the more you force against an example like an eclipse, the more the eclipse is going to kind of come down hard on you and, you know, humble you, I guess we could say. You know, I always teach with eclipses, you know, that we don't need to ritual, we don't need to do anything. Like, the eclipse itself is the ritual, the process. The more we can sort of allow life to carry us through these moments, particularly if the eclipse is touching parts of our chart. You know, not every eclipse will be the same for all of us. Sometimes it's intense for us, and other times we have a bit more of a cruisy experience. But definitely, if you have planets, you know, in the fixed signs, the eclipses are going to be touching you this year. So, you know, maybe the eclipse is forming a transiting square for you to a planet in your chart during this time. And so, yeah, that would be kind of amplifying, I think, everything we've spoken about today in a transitory type experience.
Yeah, well, for me, it lands exactly to the degree on my South Node, triggering my entire fixed T-square.
Oh, good.
So now this brings me to a point that I wanted to raise, Katie.
Sure.
We talked about this before. So I'm just throwing a curveball at you here.
Okay.
One of the things that I learned very early on, I had a teacher who was very focused on, don't look at the negatives, people know the problems, help them find the outlets, look for, like you were saying, Jupiter's transiting, grab that transiting Jupiter.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we do with T-squares is we look to the polarity of that, of that Pluto, in your case, of the focal planet of, I forgot what you called it. It's a word I know, but
I think I said apex.
Apex, thank you.
Yes.
So we look directly across from that as an outlet, both in terms of sign, house, what might be happening in your chart with that. And in your case, it's extremely interesting because in evolutionary astrology, the polarity point of Pluto is a very, very significant point, even if there's absolutely nothing there. So I wonder how you think about that, how you work with that. And of course, this eclipse will be hitting that focal point for you.
Exactly right. Like, Uranus and the eclipse are right opposite my Pluto at the moment. So like yourself, it's kind of setting off all of this stuff for me. And, I think the polarity point is really important. And, coming across evolutionary astrology and those teachings, for me personally, with all of this, this square and opposition energy that I have has been so imperative for me to be able to go deeper. It absolutely, for me, opened up a pathway of looking at oppositions and squares differently through this polarity point. And also, I want to say that learning midpoints really helped me as well. Because, for example, in an opposition, if we have, like in my chart, they're both 13 degrees, so it makes it nice and easy to do the math on this. The exact midpoint of my sun and my moon would be 13 degrees of Scorpio. Now, I want to say why it's Scorpio and not Taurus in this example is because we are counting in order of the signs. And so we would actually begin my midpoints beginning at my moon in Leo, coming up to Pluto in Scorpio, and then to my sun. But because I have them exact, 13 degrees Taurus for me is actually also a midpoint between my sun and moon going in the opposite direction. So in that sense, I kind of do have this sort of fixed cross happening here, even though I don't have anything. I don't actually have anything in Taurus at all. Just transiting Uranus at the moment, which, thanks to this eclipse, has been set off and activated in this space. And so this is a really great technique if you are wanting to, again, find sort of a almost like, I think it could be like a secret doorway, like, those escape room kind of things that you have. I actually couldn't think of anything worse than going to one of those things. I think I would panic. But I think that the polarity point can sort of function like that escape room, in that, like, you have to kind of look outside of yourself and actually work with the opposite energy frequency in order to navigate some of the complexities, we could say, I suppose, that come up through that square, that T-square or opposition. And that's something that I really learned through evolutionary astrology, is like generationally. So again, Pluto in Scorpio here, that polarity point is in Taurus. And another brilliant astrologer, Timothy Halloran, I sat in like I had like a mentoring session with him once, and it was brilliant. I really just wanted to have a bit of a chat about evolutionary astrology, and I'd been studying myself, but I was like, no, I think I want to talk with an evolutionary astrologer. And he had said to me that, this polarity point, for this generation is like, of course, a lot of millennials, with this placement, we are kind of seeking this move back to the land. And he used the example of like an interest in permaculture, for example, right? That there is this sort of generational sort of push or urge back towards these sort of very foundational Taurus type experiences to help us navigate the intensity and the heaviness and the pain of our Plutonian generation, which is that, you know, Pluto in Scorpio has come from, on a solar evolutionary level, from a lot of hardship, from a lot of pain, you know, from a lot of the information that I've read and come across from this, that it's often, you know, imagine like a lot of war and famine. And I always kind of think of like medieval kind of time period, you know, and that's also like my other secondary interest. Like I just love that time period. And I'm like, maybe I'm just channeling my Pluto by learning about this. But the polarity point, the opposite place, from this apex point, but also really in any point of your chart, can be a really fascinating part of your chart to uncover. And even if you don't have planets in that space, really want to sort of reinforce that, it's okay, because we all have, you know, all of the signs somewhere. You know, having a planet there just means that it's been activated or turned on, but we all have, you know, a Taurus cusp somewhere in our chart, unless of course it's intercepted, but we'll keep it nice and simple for this discussion today.
Katie, can you flash your chart again and maybe show people, some people can visualize this, and I think other people might be struggling a little to follow what you're saying. With your cursor, would you like to demonstrate what we're talking about with, it's Pluto's, in your case, in your specific case, it's Pluto's polarity point. In evolutionary astrology, it's everybody's Pluto's polarity point. And what we're talking about with T-squares, it's just whatever your apex or focal planet is, it's exactly opposite to that. And I love your I love your analogy of an escape door, escape hatch. My teacher always called it an outlet. Just simply an outlet. When that energy gets tight, what can you do? And you know what you can do, you can think in terms of, well, what is available to you uniquely? And if you'll show us here, maybe you can share how you do exemplify, you know, what Tim told you about the solid grounding, traditional, practical, something real when you're coming from that much pain. You know, go plant a garden, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you know, and it's so interesting. Like my whole life, like I was never interested in like cooking or anything like that. I just wasn't a good cook. You know, my mom is a brilliant cook, but because, you know, we don't have the most sort of tight connection, maybe I almost in a way like sort of rejected that on some sort of psychological level, you know, who knows. But in the last kind of year or so, actually, when progressed Venus moved to 0 Taurus in my chart, I suddenly found this love for cooking. And I'm like, oh my God, like this is bizarre. But I think about that in this sort of polarity point way. And I bring that example up because for me and for a lot of you born between, you know, 84 and 95, Taurus is going to be the sign and that also therefore that house of that polarity point for you. And so, you know, like Suzanne said about like, you know, plant a garden or get your hands in the ground. Like I have found for me, you know, nourishing and feeding myself has been such a revolutionary experience in my life. It's completely, and, you know, Uranus, of course, the planet of change and revolution, moving through that house, you know, it's definitely changed me. And I've had to, you know, it wasn't comfortable for me, you know, it was way out of my comfort zone, you know, with my T-square in my 6th, my 9th, and my 12th house in those fixed signs. You know, it's much more, you know, kind of, I'm always thinking about work and creativity and spirituality and all that stuff, but I'm not ever really thinking about the Taurus stuff, like feeding myself properly. You know, I do also have Sun conjunct Ceres, so that can come into it too. But yeah, getting into those Taurus type experiences, like touch for me has been so important. You know, having regular massage, you know, is something that really helps me come back into my body, because I think that with a Pluto in Scorpio, I think that we actually can dissociate a lot. And I know we would sort of think of that as more of a Neptunian thing, but I think because of the evolutionary journey that Pluto in Scorpio has taken prior to this incarnation, of course, we want to check out of our bodies, right? Of course, being in our body, being connected to our mind and our psyche, like it can be a lot, because there is a lot of a lot of shadow to be moved through. And so I think that finding healthful ways to be in the body, you know, for me, it's definitely been massage and touch. More so, you know, it's also intercepted in my chart. So I really need to kind of dig deep and work hard to get into that. But no matter what your apex is here, you know, moving beyond just my examples, you know, maybe, you know, your apex planet is I don't know, it's in Libra, for example. So, you know, the opposite energy for you would be Aries. And so, you know, you would really be wanting to it would be a much more of an experience around like finding your courage and, you know, being a bit more of an initiator, you know, like the way through that T square and apex of Libra, of course, is to be more I guess we could say affable, a little bit more social. You know, that would be how you could balance that T square. However, the missing link is that courage and tenacity in oneself, being a bit more of a go-getter. And so again, by learning just the very basics of like, what are the archetypes of the signs, you know, that will give you a wealth of information and knowledge. You know, sometimes I think that, you know, as amazing as astrology is, we want to explore all the little rabbit holes and all of that. But like, it's so important just to come back to those basics of like, what is Aries? What does that mean? Like, that will give you the core and the foundation of what it is that you are experiencing, you know. And I think pop astrology sometimes takes us, you know, like, it's great that astrology is becoming more well known, of course, but it really, you know, misses that core foundation, that, you know, just the basics of like sun, sorry, not sun, of the planets and the signs and the houses. Like, without that, you can't even begin to explore aspects, because okay, it's all well and good knowing you have a square in your chart, but if you don't know what, you know, Aries and Cancer is and what the similarities and differences are, it's never going to make sense to you. It's always going to seem like a foreign language instead of, you know, learning this as a language and a dialect.
Right, which is another advertisement for two teachers saying, memorize
Yes.
your basic,
Right? It's like,
you can start to do the improv, right?
exactly. You know, there's only so much that, you know, teachers can give you as well. It's like, you know, we can't handhold forever either. So it's like, you have to go back to those basics. And yes, it's boring. And maybe you think that you know everything about Aries, for example, but, you know, there's always something more in those archetypes to be found. And I think that's what is amazing about astrology, is that, you know, Aries is different for all of us based on, you know, firstly, just what house it's in for us. But then, you know, if we have planets there, or if we don't have planets there, if we have you know, a transpersonal planet transiting there, you know, that's going to completely transform the relationship that you have to that archetype within yourself. By having Pluto, you know, moving through a particular sign for 15, 20, even up to 30 years, because we are in a cycle, of course, of Pluto adding years now with all of the transits that he's making. So, you know, those planets are there for a very long time, and it's subtle. We don't wake up every day going, oh, Pluto's in my 11th house, you know, but if we peel back the layers, we actually realize with those transpersonal planets, so Pluto, Neptune, and also Uranus too, we could include Chiron as well, that, you know, this is often, you know, what's driving everything else going on from a transit perspective too. You know, it's the transpersonal, and I love the transpersonal planets. I could talk about them for days, but we'll keep to the squares for now.
We'll have you come back next time and talk about
Yes.
the transfer. You know, Katie, one last thing to talk about is
Sure.
how transiting planets that form squares to sensitive points or planets in your chart, how to, now that people are, some people already were coming at squares from this perspective, and some people are, you know, especially our mutable people out there are going, okay, I can try that. You know, the fixed signs probably are still, okay, maybe, right? A little bit of caution there.
Mhm.
But as people start to become open to, this isn't bad, I don't need to go hide for, you know, 2 years because everything's going to come back and forth. But what might they expect? What can be the gift of a transiting square?
I think that a transiting square is what really unlocks that sort of stuckness or stiffness or rigidity that can come from these placements. And so sometimes that unlocking process can come with more stiffness or stuckness. So say it's Saturn, right? Like I've had Saturn coming over all of the T squares that you've seen today, and it kind of put me in a space of really deep retreat. And I know that I needed that. And that's like a long process of feeling like I was treading water is what actually unlocked a lot of things from my past. It's my 12th house, of course. So, I needed to give myself that space. But say it was something like, I don't know, Uranus, for example, it's going to be, sudden and very kind of, unique, different. It's going to maybe make you see things in a completely different way. It's going to help, it's going to transform through revolution, even through rebelliousness. I always say to my students that Uranus, it's so important to be a rebel with a cause, because it can stimulate this kind of energy of, wanting to flip a table and saying, I'm done with this, it's too much. And that can be really healing sometimes, to just be like, oh, I'm changing everything. But if you learn how to channel that into constructive ways to support you, then you are actually able to, gift yourself your own wisdom, your own insight, your own experience. Like, it is all here within you. It's just, astrology is a great tool to help you unlock it. And so the transiting squares can absolutely be those kind of click points into that kind of experience.
No, it's great. It's wonderful. And it's also a very convenient segue into the gift that you have to offer the audience, which I want to make sure you mention before we let you go.
Yeah, absolutely. So the gift that I wanted to share with you is a workbook that I have on midlife transits. And I taught about this recently, and I felt like it was a great sort of, a segue into this square talk as well, because a lot of the midlife transits that we all have between, give or take, let's say like 38 to 45, they're squares and oppositions. And so if you are that age and are in the midst of it right now, maybe you have Neptune square Neptune right now, and you're having this kind of crisis of faith, or you have Uranus opposite Uranus, and you are in that space of like, okay, I need to flip some tables. This workbook that I have can be really supportive for you, because I've sort of just included a lot of journal reflection prompts for you. And so, using, your knowledge of astrology is great, but we sometimes want to move it out of like just the academia or the textbooks, right? And so by using your own intuition and what you know about yourself in these experiences and reflecting on them, you can actually dig a little bit deeper and get into the core of what is being brought up through those midlife transits. And if you're much younger, you have, something to kind of prepare for with that workbook. And if you've already been through them, again, it just emphasizes that space of reflection for you.
And knowing that these things are coming.
Yeah. Yep.
I mean, you can never really prepare, for Uranus opposition. It's never going to be the thing that you thought was going to need to, it's not going to be the table you thought you were going to want to overturn.
Yes.
Right? And, a number of people right now who've just had their, just because of the fluke of retrogrades, right? They've had their Saturn opposition and their Uranus opposition right within the same year, which isn't always the case. Like the Neptune square, the Pluto square, really depends on where they are. And I would also say, if you are much younger, if you already have been through these, they're still valuable, because things like Saturn square, Saturn opposition, well, that's just the midway point of Saturn's journey in the conjunction, and then the first square of the opposition, the closing square before the second return. It's valuable for everybody to go in and understand, what does it mean when Saturn just angles itself, right?
Yeah.
It's something meaningful. So everybody of every age will benefit from this. Of course, 38 to 44, 45-year-olds, it'll be like
a lot.
a user manual for them right
Exactly, exactly. But no, I think Saturn's a great example of that because, yeah, Saturn squares or opposes itself or conjuncts itself, of course, every 7 years. So, that is, we can't escape the clutches of Saturn. We think that it's done with our Saturn return, right? So much emphasis is put on that, but it's like, what about Saturn square Saturn at 21 or, another 7 years later? Like Saturn is ever present. And I hope this workbook can help you kind of unpack a little bit of that.
Yeah, and to realize that each phase is a time that it's like the lunar phases, right? As the moon is waxing and then waning, and as Saturn is not waxing and waning, of course, but as it's moving through this cycle, there's work we can do, there's seeds we can plant. We can start to look at, I forgot what word you just used. It was kind of a scary word about Saturn. I think of Saturn's influence as being like a personal mentor, because Saturn wants you to become masterful and to not live in delusion. Saturn wants you not to be pessimistic, but to learn really how to use your discretion and know what's most useful and what's wasteful. And that to me is a big part of that 38 to 45, really learning to curate the people and the relationships and behaviors in your own life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Saturn is a great mentor if you learn to work with him and not against him, which I think is that kind of maturity that Saturn then offers us, definitely post Saturn return.
Yeah, it's a perfect analogy for everything you've just been talking about.
Yeah.
How do you choose to view him and as a result, dance with him, back to your analogy? It's up to us.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I know people are going to be downloading that. They're probably doing it right now. They probably hit pause and make sure they get it. That's going to be a great thing. So thank you so much for the gift. Thank you so much for sharing and for, just being so open and real with us.
No, you're so welcome. Thank you, so much for inviting me here and allowing me that space to have that openness and, to share a bit about this. It's kind of healing in a way to talk about, especially with all that Pluto, So I hope that, everyone can kind of, see the gift of their squares instead of resisting it and trying to, jump into every other part of their chart and avoid it. You cannot avoid these squares because if you ignore the aspect natally, maybe you can get away with that for a period of time. But like the example we just gave, Saturn is eventually going to come and square itself, right? So you cannot escape these squares because there will always be some type of transiting square to unlock these gifts for you.
And I just thought of something you said to me when we were talking before. And I want you to share it with everybody because I think this is so inspiring. You said, and let me not steal your thunder, but you said something about people who have a lot of natal squares and oppositions when they reach these midlife transits. What was your observation?
Yeah, so I feel like there is a bit of more of an ease offered during that process because, if Saturn is opposing itself or Uranus is opposing itself and, you already have these kind of signatures, maybe different planets, but that signature present, you've lived it, right? Like it's just another round for you when you get to that midlife kind of age. But, for charts that have sort of less squares and things like that, it can be a bit more of almost like a culture shock. It's like, what is this? And I think that, it's not a definitive observation I've made. I don't have any statistics on it or anything like that, but it would be fascinating to kind of see, comparing lots and lots of charts of even of public figures and things like that, of going through that phase, like who were the ones that kind of sort of sailed gracefully through these midlife transits as opposed to those who, bought the sports car and the younger partner and all of that kind of stuff that often can come with those early 40s types of transits. So yeah, I think that if you do have squares and oppositions, be thankful for it because you will be able to figure out that time period slightly easier. It's not going to make it go away or easy by any means, but you have the toolkit or the toolbox already.
Which is kind of, we've been implying it and suggesting it, but it just sort of occurred to me now when you talked about that one of the gifts is it does make us stronger because inevitably we're all going to go through some challenge. We just are. We're gonna lose people. We're gonna have some challenges. financial, love, whatever. And when we've had the practice, when these planets have loved us enough to
Yep.
make us strong, we just can deal with these things, because it's not just like somebody's lucky and somebody's unlucky. It's just a natural part of life. And having that resilience and that training, if you will, just gives us that fortitude and that resilience, and that knowing that we'll get through that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think resilience is a perfect way to describe that gift. And if I was to say, like, the gift of the 90-degree angle is resilience. And I think that that's a great way to frame this, and even when you maybe are sitting with an astrologer or on the therapist's couch, if you can go into, exploring your squares or T-squares or fixed, or mutable crosses, whatever it may be, that if you can start to reframe your experiences through the lens of resilience, maybe it can just help you find a little bit of peace. It may not give you all the answers or the whys, right? Because we know that asking why often in life doesn't really get us very far. Maybe understanding how or when is a better kind of approach. And that peace that can come from that, the resilience that is built over time, I think is such a gift, such a gift.
That is a perfect place to end it. So,
yeah, I think so.
I am going to thank you again. And for people that want to learn more about you, Katie, and your beautiful school and just all your different offerings, they can visit you from the link right on the speaker page that they're launching the interview from. The gift is downloadable from here. So we're going to let you go with just tremendous gratitude. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. It was a pleasure.
And to everybody, of course, be sure to tune in to the rest of the interviews on the Secrets of Master Astrologer Summit. It's great to have you, and we'll see you again. Bye for now.